Tag TV brings you daily news bulletin from India. Breaking news and views from India.
Good evening, welcome to South Asia Newsline. I am Uzma Jaffrey. Here are the top stories we are tracking for you on Friday, the 29th of March. Two terrorists neutralized in encounter in India's Jammu and Kashmir. US trying to convince all parties for Afghan peace, says Mike Pompeo. And death toll rises to more than 20 in Dhaka high-rise blaze. And now for all the details. Security forces gunned down two terrorists in an encounter in Bulletin district of India's northern Jammu and Kashmir province on Friday morning. This came a day after four terrorists belonging to Pakistan-based terror groups were neutralized in two separate encounters in the province.
Two terrorists were killed in an encounter with security forces in Bulletin district of India's northern Jammu and Kashmir province on Friday morning. The encounter broke out after security forces had launched a cordon and search operation in Naugam area in the district following information about presence of the terrorists. Officials said as the searches were going on, the search party was fired upon by the terrorists. The fire was retaliated, leading to a gunfight in which the two terrorists were killed. Four security personnel were also reportedly injured in the encounter. India has long accused Pakistan of harbouring terror groups to use them as proxy to mount attacks on Indian soil. Pakistan denies the allegations.
India on Friday welcomed UN Security Council's move to adopt a resolution calling upon the member states to step up efforts to combat and criminalize the financing of terrorists and their activities. In a veiled reference to Pakistan, India's permanent representative at the UN, Syed Akbaruddin, said that serial offenders will continue to support terrorism, justifying their actions and inaction.
India's permanent representative at the United Nations, Syed Akbaruddin, on Friday welcomed the UN resolution to counter terror financing, and in a veiled attack at Pakistan said that serial offenders will continue to support terrorism. The UN Security Council on Thursday adopted a resolution that calls upon countries to prevent and counter the financing of terrorism, especially in its new forms. Akbaruddin emphasized that the utility of any council resolution will be in its implementation.
Terrorists are going to be ever more creative in finding ways to violate the rule book. Also, the unfortunate reality is that states who are apologists for terrorists will continue to provide alibis to justify their actions and inaction too, as was done by a serial offender earlier today.
Global momentum to rein in terrorism is picking up after the US also moved a resolution at the UN to blacklist Masood Azhar, the chief of Pakistan-based Jaish-e-Mohammed terror group. US and India have long accused Pakistan of providing safe havens to terrorists such as Masood Azhar and also the founder of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Hafiz Saeed, who is also a UN-designated terrorist. The Jaish-e-Mohammed had claimed responsibility for a suicide bomb attack which killed at least 40 Indian security personnel in India's Jammu and Kashmir province on February 14th.
Moving on. Former EU parliamentarian Paolo Casaca has expressed concern over the state-sponsored terrorism and human rights violations by Pakistan. He also urged the international community to take notice of the extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances of Sindhi and Baloch political activists.
former member of European Parliament and the executive director of the South Asia Democratic Forum, Paolo Casaca, has expressed concern over the Pakistani state-sponsored terrorism. While speaking during an event in Geneva, he highlighted that the human rights defenders and political activists in Sindh and Balochistan are regularly grappling with the threats of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. He, along with other activists and experts, called on the international community to rethink its relationship with Pakistan and to hold it accountable for blatantly ignoring the compliance of the fundamental clauses in the UN conventions.
No, it is really very bad that the international community is not looking at the state terror that it is being applied to Pakistani citizens. The Baluchis have been perhaps the major victims of this policy, the kill and dump policy. But as we see now, this policy is widespread in Pashtun areas, all across the Pashtun, where Pashtuns are living, in Sindh as well, and elsewhere.
Sindhi and Baloch activists have long accused that Pakistani security forces operate with impunity and are involved with extremist groups in committing enforced disappearances, torture and extrajudicial killings of the people. They blame that those who voice their concerns and demand even their basic rights are subjected to torture and violent crackdowns.
The United States is trying to convince all the parties, including the Afghan government and the Taliban, to come together for peace in the country. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said on Thursday. He said that the negotiations with every element inside Afghanistan are aimed to achieve an Afghan-led conversation.
Testifying before the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Thursday said the issue of troop reduction in Afghanistan depends on the outcome of peace talks between the United States and the Taliban. Pompeo said Washington is trying to convince all parties involved in the conflict in Afghanistan to come together and see if there is an agreement to overcome violence in the country. He said that the US is trying to negotiate with every element inside Afghanistan, aiming it to be Afghan-led conversation.
People are trying to convince all the parties, the government of national unity, including President Ghani, other Afghan actors, and the Taliban to come together to see if we can't find a way to reduce the violence. When we do that, we'll be able to reduce not only American forces there, but importantly the NATO forces that are located inside and working together alongside us inside of Afghanistan.
The remarks by the US Secretary of State comes as US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad has started another multi-nation trip on Afghan peace. He is expected to encourage efforts to form an inclusive negotiating team and discuss next steps in intra-Afghan discussions and negotiations.
More on news from Afghanistan. Afghanistan's Independent Election Commission on Thursday held a meeting with election stakeholders and signed cooperation agreements with them on the upcoming presidential polls. The poll body announced it needs around $192 million for the presidential, provincial and district council polls scheduled to be held in September this year.
Afghanistan's Independent Election Commission, or IEC, on Thursday held a meeting with election stakeholders and signed cooperation agreements with them on the upcoming presidential polls, which are scheduled for September 28. The poll body has estimated that $192 million are needed for the presidential, provincial and district councils and Ghazni parliamentary election, which all will be held on the same day. IEC Commissioner Mohammad Abdullah said the government and the donor countries will provide a budget for the elections.
$2 میلیون بودجه ابتدایی پیش بینی شده که دو مرجع هم داریم. اول دولت افغانستان، وزارت محترم مالیه و نهادهای کمک کننده بین المللی که هر دوی از این تاکنون همکار هستند، اما این همکاری از این مشروط به ارائه طرح بودجه مشخص کمیسیون انتخابات است.
The electoral process stakeholders assured the Election Commission that they will play the roles in holding the election successfully. Meanwhile, heads of security agencies responsible for the security during elections said they are ready to provide a secure and safe environment for the process.
Moving on to news from Bangladesh. Death toll rose to more than 20 on Friday in a fire that broke out in a 22-storied commercial building in Bangladeshi capital Dhaka on Thursday. Recovery operations continued for the second day on Friday to find and rescue victims trapped in the upscale building.
Death toll rose to more than 20 on Friday in a fire that broke out in a 22-storied commercial building in Bangladeshi capital Dhaka on Thursday, officials said. Firefighters perched on cranes smashed windows in an attempt to reach those trapped inside the building. Emergency personnel carried out charred bodies as hundreds of people gathered in the street below. A fire service and civil defense officer said more than 100 people had been rescued from the building through helicopters and ladders. The cause of the fire was not immediately clear.
The main focus হচ্ছে কোনো victim আছে কিনা, fire rebound হওয়ার আশঙ্কা আছে কিনা। এটা হচ্ছে আমাদের মূল ফোকাস। এই ফোকাস অনুযায়ী আমরা 9টা টিম ডিপ্লয় করছি সার্চ করার জন্য কোনো victim কোথাও আছে কিনা। একটা ফায়ার মনিটরিং টিম পাঠাইছি আমরা কোথাও ফায়ার রিবাউন্ড হওয়ার আশঙ্কা আছে কিনা। আর একটা লিফট মনিটরিং টিম আমরা পাঠাইছিলাম যেহেতু লিফটটা ল্যান্ডিং এ দুইটা আছে।
Meanwhile, operations continued for the second day on Friday to find and rescue other victims trapped in the upscale building in Banani area of the city. Relatives of the victims were seen grieving after receiving the bodies of victims.
In news from Nepal, a two-day-long investment summit began on Friday in Nepal's capital Kathmandu city to attract foreign investors towards the Himalayan nation. Delegates from 40 countries are taking part in the summit.
A two-day-long investment summit began on Friday in Nepal's capital Kathmandu city to attract foreign investors towards the Himalayan nation. Delegates from 40 countries, including 120 delegates from India and 265 from China, are attending the summit, in which 77 viable projects worth more than $31 billion have been showcased by the Nepal government. The summit is aimed at imparting a message of building a new Nepal among the investors. They have been informed about the business-friendly environment and abundance of natural resources and means in the country.
With India, we have duty-free arrangements for most of our products, both primary and industrial goods, while China has granted a significant number of our tariff rights duty-free access to its market.
The Himalayan nation was rattled by a strong earthquake in the year 2015. In a bid to rebuild the nation, the government at that time had organized an investment summit in 2017. More than $13 billion of foreign direct investment was committed by participating nations at that time, with India solely committing an investment of $317 million in Nepal.
A UK-based group of 50 Sikh volunteers began cleaning up the gold plating of the famous Golden Temple in India's northern Amritsar city on Thursday. The cleaning of the gold plating of the holiest shrine of Sikhism is an annual exercise conducted by the group and lasts for around 10 days.
A UK-based group of 50 Sikh volunteers began cleaning up the gold plating of the holiest shrine of Sikhism, the Golden Temple in India's northern Amritsar city on Thursday. To maintain the luster of the holy Sikh shrine, the volunteers of Guru Nanak Nishkam Sevak Jatha every year undertake the job of cleaning up the temple affected by pollution and the weather. Firstly, the dust settled on the embossed gold plating of the Golden Temple is cleaned, and then Rita or soap nut and lemon are used to scrub away any stains and restore the sheen of the shrine.
हर एक साल इस उतों सफाई करता है सोने सफाई कर आते हैं क्योंकि पोल्यूशन बहुत है मीह पैंदे हैं मीह ने पोल्यूशन टुगैदर वो काला काला हो जाता है उसनों फिर रीठे दे नाल साफ किया जाता है क्योंकि 50 संगत 50 गिनती में संगत उधर आती है.
The cleaning of the Golden Temple is an annual exercise conducted by the group that lasts for 10 days. The splendor of the Golden Temple attracts millions of devotees and tourists every year. However, the increasing level of air pollution has become a threat to the gold-plated temple.
Well, that's all we have for you from South Asia this evening. Now our viewers can watch the show on SouthAsiaNewsline.com. You can also visit us on Facebook.com/SAsiaNewsline and follow us on Twitter @SAsiaNewsline. That's all in tonight's edition. We will see you same time next week. Have a great weekend. Good night.